2014? Well, joining me to discuss the future of the party are two former Scottish Labour MPs who are also government ministers, Brian Wilson and Dame Anne Maguire. Good morning to both of you.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Brian Wilson, first of all then, I'll ask this question to both of you in fact, just generally, what does Labour need to do now?
It has to get into the debate. Really, that's the starting point. And the problem for Richard Leonard, who I don't think anybody wants to denigrate in any ways, he did his best in a difficult situation, was that he never did manage to get into that debate with Labour's very specific agenda. But I think there's a lot of space there. But I think probably maybe the biggest single position in Scottish electorate just now is for people whose priority is not to break up the United Kingdom, but to concentrate on the issues of education, but rebuilding the economy after the pandemic, education and so on. And so, it is difficult. Nobody thinks it's not difficult, but if you can get that agenda of making the maximum effect of the powers that exist, the very, very extensive powers that exist within Scotland, then Labour can get back into a debate. But it is about presentation, it is about leadership, it is about cutting through. And sadly, in this age, unless you can do that, then you can't get into the debate. So there's a huge market there for what Labour says and Labour's traditional strengths. But it's a tough job and it's a challenge over the next few months.
And yet, Anne, every time we have a new Scottish Labour leader, this kind of thing is said, that they need to concentrate on the issues that matter to people. And yet, each time, far from the situation improving, Labour seems to fall even further into decline. So what's the key to making an impact and shifting the agenda if that's what's required?
Well, I totally agree with Brian's analysis there. It is difficult to cut through against a formidable machine. And don't let us underestimate the effectiveness of the SNP machine, both particularly now that they have all the levers of power. But there is a major area for people's priorities out there. To be honest with you, people are worried about jobs, they're worried about their children's education, they're worried about the health service. And even before COVID hit us, when you look at some of the issues in Scotland, child poverty was increasing, cancer targets hadn't been met for 7 years, and yet we were unable to get that debate turned round because of the concentration on the constitutional issue. I think Keir Starmer has opened a pathway to look at a major reorganisation of governance in the UK, which doesn't just include Scotland, includes obviously Wales, Ireland, and indeed the major English conurbations. So there are pathways there, and with the right person who can manage to deal with the leadership issues and the personality issues, then I think we've got room for manoeuvre. But it's not going to be a short-term fix. But if it is, nobody would be under any illusion.
But if it is the case, Brian Wilson, that the Constitution is perhaps the barrier to Labour shifting onto its own agenda, what should Labour's position on the Constitution be with regards to both a second independence referendum, but also perhaps other ideas like further powers for the Scottish Parliament?
Well, I think that, paradoxically, what's going on outside of politics just now makes it much more straightforward. I think if it's possible to achieve a Scottish consensus on anything, it would be that you should not spend the next 4 years talking about the Constitution. There is going to be so much to be done. So, I would just say that, if the Nationalists want to turn a pandemic election into a referendum about a referendum, I don't think that's in tune with what the people of Scotland want.
But the polling would suggest otherwise, wouldn't it?
I don't think it would, because, if you look at headline figures, then these figures, are obviously the ones that are quoted. But if you look at people's priorities, the Constitution comes way down these priorities. So it's the focus. It's not the priorities that are the problem, it's the focus.
But nonetheless, the people want Labour to have a position on a second independence referendum, and that's not always been clear.
I think Labour's position for these elections should be absolutely clear. No second independence referendum during the lifetime of this Parliament. every ounce of focus on using the devolved powers to maximum effect in order to deal with the terrible consequences that are going to be from the pandemic for every family in the country. That is the message. And then see, we're then talking 4 or 5 years ahead. Let's see where it is from there. And I never have a second referendum kind of guy. People, if there is a demand for it, then I'm a Democrat above all, so be it. But surely everyone can unite on saying that the priority for the next 4 years is to deal with the pandemic, using devolved powers most effectively, creating an industrial strategy where none exists, and really using these devolved powers for the maximum effect for Scotland. And if Labour comes out that position, then that is a lot stronger message than saying have a referendum about a referendum.
Anne Maguire.
I think that's right. Although opinion polls are snapshots, but when people actually have to focus on what the next Scottish Parliament is going to do in what effectively will be a reconstruction of both our health service, our economy, our education system, then I think there is room there for a strong Labour leader to get that space, to get the debate turned round. Brian's right. I don't think the majority of people in this country want to get bogged down again in another constitutional debate. We had one 6 years ago. Fair enough, we might have one in another 10 years. But at the moment, the priority for people is to get their lives back to some normality. And that normality is about jobs, education, the health service, and we need someone who can cut through and who can put the SNP government behind the 8 ball on these issues.
But Anne Maguire, isn't that a case though of Labour just continuing to refuse to listen to the voters? So if the SNP get a majority at the next election, which does seem to be forecast, then people surely have voted for a party which is offering a second independence referendum. Why should Labour say no to that?
You can say that, but the SNP won a majority in 2011, and in 2014 people in Scotland, when they were asked the specific question, not the generality of a menu that you get at a general election, but when they were asked a specific issue, they rejected it. But I don't want to get us bogged down in a constitutional debate. I want to go on to the real issues that are impacting on families at the moment. I listened to some of you, the nurse being interviewed this morning, and she talked about the fear around both the health service and indeed in the wider community. And that's what we have got to focus our attention on, focus our policies on, and get a cut through in terms of how we reconstruct after COVID.
OK. Dame Anne Maguire and Brian Wilson, both thanks so much indeed.